The rain fell heavily on the old manor perched atop the hill, the sound of thunder blending with Clara's silent sobs. From her bedroom window, she watched the drops sliding down the glass, wishing that each one would carry away a piece of the pain that suffocated her chest. Downstairs, the murmur of muffled conversations felt distant, but she knew that her future was being decided there, without her voice being heard. Clara was 19, a young woman with wavy chestnut hair and eyes that once gleamed with curiosity and hope. Ever since her mother's death 5 years ago, everything in her life had changed. Her father, once kind and affectionate, had become a bitter, withdrawn man. The family's debts grew, the farm's business began to fail, and whatever remained of the Farias family's wealth slipped away like sand through their fingers. She descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking beneath her. Feet in the living room, her father sat in his usual armchair, while an imposing man in a sharp black suit observed the scene with a mixture of disdain and superiority. He was Mr. Collins, a wealthy businessman, heir to an impressive fortune, and owner of vast lands and enterprises throughout the region. "Clara, sit down," her father ordered, without even lifting his eyes to meet hers. His rough voice cut through the heavy air like a blade. She obeyed, feeling the cold knot tightening in her stomach, sensing that something dark was approaching. "Mr. Collins and I have reached an agreement," he continued, his tone trying to disguise the shame that clung to his words. "You will marry him." The words, simple and direct, fell like a death sentence. Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her lungs. She tried to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. Her desperate gaze turned to Mr. Collins, who studied her with a slight smirk, as if he was examining a valuable acquisition rather than a human being. "I know it's difficult, Clara," her father attempted to justify, but there was no trace of regret in his voice. "But we need stability, and Mr. Collins has assured me that it will be possible if you do your part." "Stability?" she managed to whisper at last, her voice trembling. "You're selling me, Father. This isn't about stability. It's about money, isn't it?" Her father averted his eyes, and for a moment she saw the weakness and desperation in them. But he quickly hardened again, sealing himself behind a mask of coldness. "It's what's best for all of us. You need to understand that." Clara stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly across the wooden floor. The tears that had been silent now flowed freely, mixing with the brokenness in her voice. "I don't want this. I can't do this. I don't love this man, and he certainly doesn't love me. This is a nightmare." But Mr. Collins remained impassive, watching the scene as if it were merely an unremarkable performance. "Miss Farias, I believe your father has explained the situation to you. I offer comfort, a life of luxury. In return, I expect you to fulfill your role as my wife, and perhaps, in time, you will learn to appreciate me." The chill in his voice sent a shiver down Clara's spine, as if she stood before a beast disguised as a man. Her father, head bowed, no longer had the courage to meet her eyes. He knew he had lost a part of himself by betraying his own daughter in this way. But greed and fear of poverty had spoken louder than any love he might still have had for her. Clara ran from the room, her heart shattered, unsure of where to go or how to escape the reality forced upon her. The storm outside seemed to intensify, mirroring the turmoil raging inside her as she wept in her room. Mr. Collins, sitting in the living room next to her father, flashed a cold, calculated smile. "Don't worry, Mr. Farias," he said with a tone of condescension. "She will adapt, and I know well how to tame a rebellious spirit. Will Clara find a way to escape this forced fate, or is she destined for a life of submission and sacrifice?" Clara's days turned into a blur after the agreement was made. Her father's decision loomed over her like a dark cloud, casting a shadow on everything she once found joy in. She wandered the grounds of the estate, feeling like a stranger in her own home, her mind desperately searching for a way out. But every thought of escape was met with the cold reality. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The world beyond their estate's iron gates felt as confining as the life her father had thrust upon her. Each evening, Clara would hear the sound of Mr. Collins's car rolling up the gravel driveway, a sleek black machine that looked as polished and cold as its owner. He would sit in the parlor with her father, discussing plans for the wedding with the efficiency of a business deal. To Mr. Collins, Clara was a means to an end, a way to expand his influence in the region by acquiring the Farias name and lands. But behind the sharp lines of his suit and the chilling control in his voice, there was something darker, a possessiveness that made Clara's skin crawl whenever he looked at her. One evening, she mustered the courage to confront her father again, hoping for some last shred of compassion. She found him in the study, surrounded by stacks of papers, bills, unpaid debts, documents that represented the crumbling legacy of the Farias family. He looked up when she entered, his eyes tired and shadowed by the weight of his choices. "Please, Father," she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. "I can find a way to help. I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes, but don't make me marry him. I don't love him. I don't even know him." Her father's expression softened for a brief moment, but then the hardness returned, like a door slamming shut. "You don't understand, Clara," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're young. You don't know what it's like to see everything you've built fall apart. This is the only way to save what's left, Collins. He's the only one who can give us a future." "But what about my future?" Clara's voice cracked, the pain breaking through. "What about my life? My choices? You're throwing me away for a few more years of comfort. You're trading me like I'm some property." Her father's gaze turned cold, and he stood up abruptly, towering over her in the small study. "Enough, Clara. This is done. You will marry him, and that's final. You'll learn to accept it, just as I have learned to live with the choices I've made." With those words, he turned away from her, leaving Clara standing in the doorway, her heart breaking a little more. With each step he took away from her, the days slipped by until, one morning, a letter arrived with a golden seal bearing the initials WC. Inside was a roses had grown wild, their vines wrapping around the rusting iron trellises, but their scent was still a reminder of gentler days. As she sat among the overgrown bushes, her thoughts turned to the small bundle of belongings she had hidden under her bed. Letters from her mother, a photo of happier times, and a few coins she had secretly saved. It wasn't much, but it represented hope, a fragile seedling in a field of despair. She closed her eyes, imagining herself running far from the manor, in precise, away from Mr. Collins's cold gaze, and her father's harsh formalized in 2 weeks. Yet, deep down, prepare yourself. She knew that a new chapter wouldn't save her. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words to those who ventured into it with nothing but dreams. In a and Mr. Collins, with all and the air in the manor seemed colder would not let her go so easily. She ran outside that evening, desperate as she sat at the dinner table with her father. She found and Mr. Collins in the old rose garden. She decided to try a different approach. And her mother had she gathered her courage when she was a child. Looked directly into Mr. Collins' began to take shape for the first time. There was no guarantee that she could escape successfully, unflinching, but she knew and she couldn't simply wait for the day when Mr. Collins would put a ring on her finger and bind her to a life she hadn't chosen. Her voice she needed a plan inside. A way you may have convinced my father even that if this arrangement is desperate for him. But what the next morning, Clara visited the small market on the outskirts of town. Other families a rare privilege that her father had allowed her. He smiled thinking at her she was buying items for the smile. She sank that did not reach his eyes. Her body trembling with exhaustion. Than I gave you credit lit a small oil lamp. Your family's casting a warm glow over the dim space. Of course, valuable to me. He crouched by the stove. But there is something else working to light a fire. I see a fire. The soft crackle of kindling filling the silence between. I enjoy the challenge as the fire caught. Clara allowed herself a moment to down her spine, to let the reality of her situation sink in. Spoken like a man she was far from he had the upper hand, but she was free. But there was something else there. For now, a hint of obsession that in the way he, however fragile, she clenched he's trying to force on you, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you get that chance. His words carried a weight that settled deep, forcing her voice to remain calm. For the first time, you will find she allowed herself to believe that maybe, tamed, just maybe, Mr. Collins she wasn't fighting this battle alone, but there was no any more in it. As dawn approaches of the can struggle Clara to come, and Thomas outmaneuver Mr. Collins's relentless pursuit? Or will as their wedding day alliance will Clara find the strangers that lie ahead? Or will Mr. Pale Light Collins tighten his opening the door wider, binding her in golden chains? But if trouble follows you, Thomas, you know I can't afford to stick my neck out too Clara far. Closer to the date. We understand. That felt like Thomas a noose replied tightening around her guiding neck. Clara inside. The manor buzzed just with give preparations us for the wedding. At least for a little while. Tailors, Sam and closed the door behind moved in, bolting it shut like busy and led them into a small, oblivious to the quiet desperation in Clara's eyes of the tavern. Her father buried himself in the logistics, the scent of stale air and smoke at every turn. But it was warm, as if he could escape the guilt by keeping his eyes met occupied, wide with desperation. Escape her reality, but she saw the same resolve in his gaze. One evening that she felt slipped away from her own chest and found herself she shook her head in the old rose tightening garden. Her hold on the knife. The air was thick. We end this together, please. Don't ask me to leave you behind the earth after a recent rain. Clara knelt beside a cluster of wild roses, mouth, their thorns pricking her fingers, lighting his eyes. As she plucked a few petals absently, he murmured. Squeezing lost her in hand, thought, one last a breeze rustled together. Through the overgrown they rose from there, carrying with it the whispers of 1,000 unspoken dreams. As she stood up, she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned quickly, expecting one of the housemaids. Instead, she found Mr. Collins watching her, his silhouette dark against the twilight sky. "You seem to find solace here," he remarked, his voice smooth, yet with an edge that made Clara feel as though she were being stalked by a predator. He stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel path, the distance between them shrinking. Clara's back stiffened, but she forced herself to remain calm, meeting his gaze head on. "It's one of the few places left that hasn't been tainted by all of this," she replied, gesturing towards the manor with a bitter edge in her voice. Mr. Collins smiled, but his expression was that of someone who enjoyed a game with no real competition. "You speak as though I am your enemy. Clara, I would think with time, you might come to appreciate the life I'm offering you. a life of comfort, free from the uncertainties that plague most. "And what about the uncertainties that plague me now?" she shot back, her voice rising despite herself. "I am not a prize to be won, Mr. Collins. I am not some land or business deal you can close. I am a person with thoughts, feelings, and dreams." He interrupted her, his smile fading as his gaze turned cold. "Do not be foolish, Clara. Dreaming is a luxury that belongs to those who can afford it. You, like your father, are out of time and out of options." Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her. Burning through the fear, she clenched her fists, feeling the rough thorns from the rose stems press into her palms, their sharpness a reminder of the reality she could not escape. Yet, in that moment, she made a silent vow to herself. She would not go down without a fight. That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her room. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor, twisting and turning like the thoughts in her mind. She slipped out of bed quietly and knelt beside the loose floorboard she had discovered years ago. Beneath it, she pulled out the small bundle of belongings she had hidden. She spread the items out on the wooden floor. The letters, the photo, the coins, and as she did, wedding preparations. Instead, she spoke quietly with an old woman who ran a stall of second-hand clothes. She left with a simple dress, unremarkable and plain, something that would allow her to blend in if she ran. It was a small step, but it was a seed of rebellion. As the days passed, Clara hid her preparations, wrapping the dress carefully and placing it beneath the floorboard, gathering food from the kitchen when she could. She even studied the guards who patrolled the manor grounds, noting their shifts and routines. The fear of being caught weighed heavily on her, but each small act of defiance gave her a sense of control over her fate, a way to reclaim a part of herself that had been lost. Yet, Mr. Collins's presence continued to haunt her like a shadow. He visited more frequently, speaking with her father about their upcoming union, and though he rarely addressed her directly, his eyes followed her every move. Clara could feel his unspoken threats, the quiet promise that he would not allow his prize to slip through his fingers, and with each passing day, the tension between them grew, tightening like a rope. One afternoon, as they stood together in the drawing room, Clara's father stepped out to speak with one of the workers, leaving her alone with Mr. Collins. He approached her slowly, standing too close for comfort, and Clara felt the air grow colder around them. "Tell me, Clara," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you believe that defiance makes you stronger? That by resisting, you can change what is already written?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I believe that some things are worth fighting for, Mr. Collins. Freedom, choice, even dignity." He chuckled, the sound low and mocking, as if he found her defiance amusing. "You may find, my dear, that freedom is an illusion, and dignity is a luxury that those in your position cannot afford." Before she could respond, her father returned, and Mr. Collins's smile softened back into its usual mask of civility. But Clara could feel the unspoken warning that lingered in the air. He knew that she was trying to fight back, and he was letting her know that it would be futile. With the wedding date fast approaching, Clara's resolve is tested. Can she make her escape before Mr. Collins's grip tightens further, or will she be trapped in a fate that threatens to strip away everything she holds dear? The morning sun cast long shadows over the manor, But Clara felt no warmth in its light. The wedding was now only days away, and the preparations buzzed around her like a hive of bees. But beneath the calm facade she maintained, her thoughts were a storm. She knew that time was running out, and if she wanted to avoid being bound to a man she despised, she had to act soon. Clara spent every moment she could away from the eyes of the staff, retreating to the quiet corners of the estate where she could go over her plan in silence. She had studied the guards' routines meticulously and knew the shift changes by heart. There was a small window late at night when the eastern gate was left unguarded for just a few minutes. Barely enough time for someone to slip through unnoticed. It was a slim chance, but it was all she had. She clutched the plain dress she had bought at the market, hidden beneath the floorboard, as if it were a lifeline. Tonight, she told herself, tonight she would make her move. That evening, during dinner, she forced herself to sit at the table with her father and Mr. Collins, her hands trembling slightly as she picked at her food. Mr. Collins watched her with an unsettling calm, his gaze lingering on her as if he could read the secrets hidden behind her eyes. Clara kept her expression neutral, offering polite but curt responses whenever he spoke to her. But inside, her heart raced with each tick of the clock on the wall. "Your nerves betray you, Clara," Mr. Collins remarked at one point, his voice soft yet sharp. "It's quite natural for a bride-to-be to feel anxious, of course, but I do hope you're not thinking of anything foolish." Clara looked up, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze, though her pulse quickened. "I have no intention of being foolish, Mr. Collins. I only want to get through this with as much grace as possible." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he said nothing more, simply sipping his wine with a knowing look. Clara turned her attention back to her meal, forcing herself to remain calm, even as a chill ran through her at the thought that he might suspect her plans. That night, Clara waited until the house had settled into silence. She slipped out of bed and changed into the plain dress, leaving her usual clothes folded neatly as if she'd only stepped out for a moment. She gathered her small bundle, some food, the precious letters, and the few coins she had managed to save. Her hands trembled as she tied the bundle tightly, but she steeled herself, breathing deeply to calm the panic rising in her chest, creeping down the servants' stairs. She avoided the rooms where her father and Mr. Collins slept. The corridors felt colder in the dark, the shadows stretching long and deep, and she flinched at every creak of the old wood beneath her feet. But she kept moving, clinging to the hope that she could slip through the eastern gate before anyone noticed her absence. The night air was crisp and biting when she finally reached the grounds outside. She moved quickly along the side of the manor, keeping close to the walls to remain unseen. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the estate, but the darkness worked in her favor. She could see the eastern gate just ahead, unguarded for now. Just as she had hoped, Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she hurried forward. The bundle clutched tightly in her arms. She reached the gate and pushed it open. Wincing at the faint squeak of the hinges, she slipped through and closed it behind her, breathing a sigh of relief as she found herself outside the manor's boundaries for the first time in months. But just as she turned to run, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. Mr. Collins. His expression was unreadable, his features cast in sharp relief by the moonlight. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. "I wondered how long it would take you to try this," he said, his voice low and controlled. There was a hint of amusement in his tone, but his eyes were cold, hard as ice. "Did you really think you could leave so easily, Clara?" She took a step back, clutching the bundle tighter, but he reached out and grabbed her wrist with surprising force. Yanking her closer, the bundle fell from her hands, spilling its contents onto the ground. Coins glinting in the moonlight, a few pieces of bread scattering across the gravel. "Let go of me," she demanded, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened painfully. "You're not leaving," he hissed, leaning closer until she could feel his breath against her cheek. "You belong to me now. Your father made sure of that, and I won't allow you to ruin my investment." Fear and anger flared within her, mingling into a desperate strength. She twisted in his grasp and stomped on his foot as hard as she could, causing him to grunt in pain and loosen his hold just enough for her to wrench free. She turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her bare feet pounding against the cold earth. Mr. Collins's shout echoed behind her, but she didn't look back. The dark fields stretched before her, offering a chance, however slim, at freedom. Clara's feet pounded against the cold earth, each step echoing through the darkness as she ran, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The night air stung her lungs, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Not when Mr. Collins was so close behind. She could hear the crunch of gravel as he pursued her, his footsteps growing louder. With each second, she darted through the overgrown fields that surrounded the estate, the tall grass whipping at her legs. Her thin dress offered little protection from the branches that clawed at her skin, but she pressed on, her heart hammering in her chest like a frantic drumbeat. The moonlit landscape blurred around her, but she focused on the shadows ahead, hoping they would hide her long enough to find refuge. "Clara!" Mr. Collins's voice cut through the night, sharp with anger. "You can't run forever!" The sound sent a chill through her, but she forced herself to keep going, pushing her legs to move faster. The manor's lights grew distant behind her, fading into the darkness, but the fear that twisted inside her only grew stronger. Clara knew she had no allies, no safe place to hide. Her only chance was to reach the edge of the estate and disappear into the forest beyond, where the dense trees might shield her from sight. Her bare feet slipped on the uneven ground, and she stumbled, nearly falling face first into the mud. She caught herself just in time, but the moment's hesitation allowed Mr. Collins to close the gap between them. She heard him thrashing through the underbrush, his breath harsh and ragged with fury. Desperation clawed at her insides as she veered toward a narrow path she remembered from childhood, one that wound through a dense grove of trees where she and her mother once played hide and seek. Back then, it had felt like a magical place, a hidden world away from the troubles of the real one. Now, it was her last hope of escape. The trees closed in around her, their branches arching overhead to form a shadowy tunnel. Clara's breath came in sharp bursts, and she strained to hear over the pounding of her own heart. She pushed herself deeper into the grove, praying that the darkness would hide her, that the thick canopy would muffle the sound of her frantic breathing. She crouched behind the trunk of a gnarled oak, pressing her back against the rough bark. Her body shook with adrenaline, and she clamped a hand over her mouth, trying to quiet the gasps that threatened to give her away. She could hear Mr. Collins's footsteps slowing, the crack of twigs and rustling leaves as he moved closer. Clara. His voice was softer now, coaxing, like a hunter luring prey out of hiding. You don't have to make this difficult. Come back, and I might still be lenient. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears. His words were laced with a cold, false kindness, but she could hear the underlying threat in them. He would never forgive her for this attempt to flee. If he caught her now, he would make sure she never had the chance to run again. The footsteps grew closer, and she held her breath, pressing herself as tightly as she could against the tree. Through the darkness, she caught a glimpse of his figure moving just a few yards away. His shadow, blending with the twisted branches, he paused, turning his head as if listening for any sound, any sign of movement. Clara's chest ached with the effort of staying silent, but she didn't dare shift even an inch. She watched him, waiting for the moment when he might turn away, might move further into the woods in search of her. Her muscles burned from the tension, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she forced herself to stay still. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Collins turned and moved deeper into the grove, his footsteps receding into the darkness. Clara waited, counting the seconds, straining to hear the faintest sound that might betray his return, only when she was certain he was far enough away. Did she release the breath she'd been holding? Her lungs burning with relief, she slipped quietly from her hiding place, creeping along the edge of the path until the forest began to thin out ahead. She could see the dark outline of the trees giving way to open land, the distant lights of the neighboring village flickering like fireflies against the horizon. If she could just make it to the village, she might find shelter, might be able to vanish into the crowds long enough to buy herself some time. But as she took her first step forward, a hand shot out from the shadows, gripping her arm with a vice-like hold. Clara let out a strangled cry as she was yanked backward, nearly losing her footing. She twisted around, expecting to see Mr. Collins's furious face, but instead found herself staring into the wide eyes of a young man, his features half hidden by the darkness. "Shh," he whispered urgently, pressing a finger to his lips. "Do you want him to find us?" Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't comprehend what was happening. The stranger's grip on her arm was firm but not painful, and there was no malice in his expression, only concern and a hint of something else, something like determination. Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely more than a breath. He glanced over his shoulder, his gaze darting toward the direction where Mr. Collins had disappeared. "No time for that now. If you want to get out of here, you need to trust me." Clara hesitated, her mind racing with doubts and questions. But then she heard the distant crunch of leaves, the sound of Mr. Collins's return. She looked back at the stranger, his face partially illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, and saw a flicker of urgency in his eyes. "Please," he urged, tightening his grip on her arm. "We have to go now." Clara swallowed her fear and nodded, allowing him to pull her deeper into the woods, away from the path she had once thought might lead her to freedom. The stranger's pace was swift but careful, guiding her through the dense undergrowth, each step taking her further from the life she was running from, and into the unknown, The forest closed in around them as Clara followed the stranger deeper into the shadows. The branches whipped against her skin, the night air cold on her cheeks, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, hope, and uncertainty, all tangled up with the urgency of their flight. Every rustle of leaves felt like Mr. Collins creeping closer, every snap of a twig like a reminder that she was not yet safe. The young man's grip on her arm was steady as he led her through the dense underbrush, his movements swift and sure, as though he knew these woods like the back of his hand. Clara's mind raced with questions. Who was he? And why was he helping her? But she didn't dare break the silence, not while they were still so close to the danger they were fleeing. They finally reached a small clearing where the moonlight broke through the canopy of trees, casting a pale glow over the ground. The stranger released her arm, turning to face her, his expression a mixture of urgency and reassurance. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice low but firm. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether she might bolt again at any second. "But we need to keep moving. It's not safe to stay in one place for long." Clara took a step back, trying to catch her breath. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, and she pressed a hand against her ribs, the fear still gnawing at her insides. Why are you helping me?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling with the mix of emotions. "Who are you?" The stranger hesitated, glancing toward the direction they'd come from, as if expecting Mr. Collins to emerge from the darkness at any moment. He was young, probably just a few years older than Clara, with unruly dark hair that fell into his eyes and a rough coat that looked as though it had seen better days. "Name's Thomas," he said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been working on your father's land for a while now, doing odd jobs. I've seen enough to know what kind of man Mr. Collins is. I couldn't just stand by and watch him." He broke off, running, a hand through his hair, his expression darkening. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have no choices." Clara studied him, searching his face for any hint of deception. She wanted to trust him. He was, after all, her only ally in this desperate moment. But the fear of being tricked again lingered in her chest. She took a step closer, her voice still edged with uncertainty. "Why should I believe you? How do I know this isn't some trap he set?" Thomas met her gaze evenly, his expression serious. "You don't," he admitted, his voice tinged with a sadness that surprised her. "But if you stay here, he will find you, and then you'll never have another chance to get away." Clara's throat tightened. She knew he was right. The memory of Mr. Collins's cold grip on her arm, his voice filled with possessive rage, sent a shiver through her. She couldn't afford to waste this opportunity, even if it meant placing her trust in a stranger. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the whispering wind. "I'll trust you for now, but if you betray me, Thomas, I will find a way to escape, no matter what." Thomas gave a small, grim smile, as if he understood her mistrust all too well. "Fair enough, Clara. Now let's get moving before he catches up." They moved quickly through the woods, Thomas guiding her with sure steps through the darkness. He led her along hidden paths, through streams that masked their scent, and beneath low-hanging branches that concealed their movements. Clara's legs ached, her lungs burning with every breath, but she pushed herself to keep up, knowing that any delay could be fatal. As they trudged through a narrow ravine, Thomas finally spoke again, his tone softer, less urgent. "There's a place a few miles from here, an old cabin where I sometimes stay when work on the manor is slow. It's hidden enough that he won't find us right away." Clara glanced at him, trying to read the sincerity in his words. She could see the strain in his expression, the worry etched into his features, and it struck her that he was risking just as much as she was by helping her. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling heavy and strange on her tongue. It had been so long since she had trusted anyone with her vulnerability. Thomas only nodded, not breaking his stride. "Don't thank me yet, we're not out of this mess, not by a long shot." After what felt like hours, they reached the cabin, a small, weathered structure half buried in the thick undergrowth. Thomas pushed open the creaky door, revealing a simple interior with a rough-hewn table, a small stove, and a cot against one wall. The air inside was cold, but it was dry, and for the first time in days, Clara felt a flicker of hope filled her with a determination she hadn't felt in years. Thomas glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression softening as he saw the weariness in her eyes. "You should rest. It's a long way to the village, and if he's tracking us, we'll need to move again before dawn." Clara nodded, lying back on the cot. But sleep didn't come easily. The memory of Mr. Collins's voice, the way he had taunted her in the dark, echoed in her mind, mingling with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She looked over at Thomas, who now sat near the door, his back turned to her as he kept watch. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper in the quiet cabin. He turned, his expression questioning. "Do you really think we can make it out of this?" Away from him. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire, before finally speaking. "I don't know, but I do know that you deserve more than the—" Of dawn crept through the cabin's small, grimy window, casting a soft glow over the rough wooden floor. Clara lay awake on the cot, listening to the steady crackle of the fire in the stove, and the occasional creak of the wind pressing against the cabin's weathered walls. Exhaustion clung to her body like a heavy blanket, but her mind refused to rest, racing with thoughts of the night before. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of Thomas by the door, his back against the wall as he kept watch. His face was cast in shadow, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. He hadn't slept, she realized. He had stayed awake through the night, guarding their fragile shelter against whatever might come out of the darkness. Clara shifted on the cot, wincing as her muscles protested the movement. Thomas turned at the sound, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. He gave her a tired smile, but there was a grim determination in his expression that sent a shiver through her. "It's almost morning," he said quietly. "We'll need to leave soon if we want to stay ahead of him." Clara nodded, sitting up slowly. The reality of their situation settled over her like a chill, but she took a deep breath, pushing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Do you think he's still looking for me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Men like him don't give up easily, Clara, especially not when they think something belongs to them." He glanced toward the window, the morning light catching the sharp lines of his face. "But we have a head start, and if we keep moving, We might reach the village before he can track us down." Clara felt a pang of fear at his words, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the urgency in his voice. She forced herself to stand, gathering the bundle she had brought with her. Though there was little left after their escape, Thomas handed her a small canteen of water, and she accepted it with a nod of gratitude, taking a long drink to steady herself as they prepared to leave the cabin. Clara hesitated, her gaze lingering on Thomas. She could feel the weight of the risks he was taking by helping her, and a question bubbled up inside her before she could stop it. "Thomas, why did you come back for me last night? You could have just stayed out of this, kept your distance." Thomas paused, glancing at her with a look that was almost unreadable. For a moment, the mask of determination slipped, revealing something deeper, something raw and vulnerable that made Clara's heart ache. "I told you, Clara, I know what it's like to be trapped, to feel like you have no choices left." He looked away, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I couldn't just watch him take that away from you." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the unspoken weight of his words settle between them. She didn't know what kind of past he carried, what wounds or scars had led him to this moment, but she understood the pain of feeling powerless, of having your life slip out of your hands. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a spark of something warm, a connection, however fragile, with someone who saw her not as a burden or a prize, but as a person. "Thank you," she said softly, the sincerity in her voice surprising even herself. Thomas met her gaze again, and for a brief moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet understanding. They set off through the woods, the morning air cool and damp against Clara's skin. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale glow over the treetops, but the shadows beneath the canopy remained thick and dark. Thomas moved with purpose, guiding her along hidden trails that wound through the forest, away from the main paths. Clara followed closely, her breath coming in steady puffs, her mind focused on each step, each careful movement that carried her further from the life she had fled. They didn't speak much as they walked, both of them keenly aware of the need for silence. The forest was quiet around them, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But even in the stillness, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Mr. Collins was somewhere out there, tracking their every step. After several hours of walking, they paused near a stream to rest. Thomas crouched by the water's edge, refilling the canteen, while Clara sank down on a fallen log, her legs trembling with fatigue. She ran a hand through her tangled hair, trying to ignore the ache in
her muscles, the hunger that gnawed at her stomach. He said, handing her the canteen. She took it gratefully, drinking deeply, the cool water a balm against the dryness in her throat. As she lowered the canteen, she caught sight of movement in the distance, a flicker of something dark, the shadow of a figure slipping through the underbrush. Her heart lurched, and she grabbed Thomas's arm, her grip tightening with panic.
"Did you see that?" she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the stream. Thomas turned quickly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. He tensed, his hand moving to the knife tucked into his belt. A small, worn blade, but sharp enough to offer some protection. "Stay close," he said under his breath, his voice taut with tension. "If he's found us, we'll have to run." Clara's pulse quickened, and she rose to her feet, her hands shaking as she clutched the bundle against her chest. She could feel the thudding of her heart in her ears, the cold sweat on her skin as they waited, listening for any sound, any sign of pursuit. But after a moment, the forest fell silent once more, the shadows still and unmoving. Thomas exhaled slowly, lowering the knife, though his expression remained tense. "It might have been an animal," he said, but there was an edge of doubt in his voice. Clara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching them from the darkness. She glanced at Thomas, trying to draw strength from his steady presence, but the fear gnawed at her insides, twisting her stomach into knots. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "The village, it's our best chance." Thomas hesitated, then nodded, his jaw set with determination. "All right, let's go." As they continued through the forest, the air grew colder, the light dimmer beneath the thick canopy of trees. Clara kept her focus on the path ahead, her thoughts swirling with fear and hope. Every step brought them closer to the edge of the woods, closer to the village where they might find sanctuary, but also closer to the moment when Mr. Collins might catch up, when everything they had fought for could come crashing down. Thomas moved beside her, his expression grim, but there was a fire in his eyes that mirrored her own, a determination to see this through, no matter the risks. Clara clung to that fire, letting it fuel her, even as doubt gnawed at her heart. The forest slowly thinned as Clara and Thomas made their way through the undergrowth, the trees giving way to patches of open land where the sunlight dappled the ground. Clara could feel the tension between them growing, a silent urgency that pushed them onward, though they had put some distance between themselves and the manor. The weight of Mr. Collins's pursuit loomed over them, a shadow that refused to fade. Thomas kept glancing over his shoulder, his expression tense, his hand never straying far from the knife at his belt. Clara knew that his worry mirrored her own. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made her flinch, each sound a reminder that Mr. Collins might be closer than They dared to hope. They finally reached a low ridge that overlooked the village below, its rooftops just visible through the thin morning mist. The sight of the small town should have brought relief, but instead it only filled Clara with a gnawing anxiety. She knew that reaching the village wouldn't guarantee their safety. Mr. Collins's influence stretched far, and he would likely be willing to use whatever power he had to track her down. Thomas crouched beside her, scanning the landscape with a cautious eye. "We need to be careful," he murmured. "If he has people looking for us, the village could be dangerous." Clara swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She had hoped that the village would be a haven, a place where they could find refuge. But now the thought of walking into its narrow streets felt like stepping into a trap. "What do we do then?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "We can't stay out here forever." Thomas was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant rooftops. Then he turned to her, his expression resolute. "There's an old friend of mine who might help us. He runs a small tavern on the edge of the village. He's not the type to ask too many questions. If we can reach him without being seen, he might let us hide there for a while." Clara nodded, clinging to the thin thread of hope his words offered. "Okay, let's go, before anyone notices us." They descended the ridge cautiously, keeping to the shadows where the forest's cover still lingered. As they reached the edge of the village, Clara pulled the hood of her cloak over her head, hoping to disguise herself from prying eyes. Thomas led the way through the winding alleys, his steps quick and purposeful, guiding her past quiet homes and shuttered shops. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, mingling with the distant murmur of voices from the village square. Clara kept her head down, focusing on Thomas's back, every sense on high alert. She knew that they were risking everything by coming here, but she also knew that they had no other choice if they wanted any chance of escaping Mr. Collins's reach. They would have to trust in the kindness of a stranger. They finally arrived at a small, weather-beaten tavern nestled at the edge of the village, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Thomas knocked on the back door in a rhythmic pattern, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal a middle-aged man with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. "Thomas," the man said, his voice rough with surprise. "Didn't think I'd see you again, lad. And who's this?" Thomas glanced at Clara, then back at the man. "A friend in need of help, Sam. Can we come in?" The man, Sam, studied Clara with a wary frown. But then he stepped, and for the first time in what felt like days, Clara felt a flicker of relief. "You can stay here for the night," Sam said, crossing his arms as he studied them both. "But in the morning, you'll need to decide what comes next. This isn't a safe place to hide forever." Thomas nodded, but there was a tightness in his expression, a hint of unspoken worry that sent a chill through Clara. She knew that even with Sam's help, their safety was far from guaranteed. As night fell, Clara sat on the small cot that Sam had offered, her mind racing with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Thomas sat across the room, sharpening his knife with a focused intensity, his face set in hard lines. For a while, they sat in silence, the tension between them mingling with the hum of the tavern beyond the walls. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. Do you think we'll ever really be free of him?" Thomas looked up, his expression softening as he met her gaze. He set the knife aside, leaning forward slightly. "I don't know, Clara, but I do know that we can't give up. Not now, when we've come this far." Clara's throat tightened, a mix of fear and gratitude welling up inside her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to find comfort in his words. "I don't know if I could have made it this far without you, Thomas," she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of everything they had faced together. He reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. "You're stronger than you think, Clara. You've survived more than most people could handle, and whatever happens next, we'll face it together." She looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth spread through her chest despite the fear that still lingered. For a moment, the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them in this small, dim room, sharing a fragile hope. But before she could say more, the door to the room creaked open, and Sam appeared, his face pale and drawn with worry. "Thomas," he said in a low, urgent voice, "you need to see this." Clara's heart leapt into her throat as she followed Thomas to the door. Sam led them to a window that overlooked the narrow alley behind the tavern. In the dim light, Clara saw a small group of men moving through the shadows, their eyes scanning the doorways and windows. One of them held a lantern high, its beam cutting through the darkness, and Clara's breath caught in her chest as she recognized the cold, sharp features of Mr. Collins among them. "Looks like your trouble found you, after all," Sam muttered, his voice grim. "He's got men with him, if they search the tavern. We need to get out of here. Thomas said, his voice urgent as he turned to Clara. Now, with Mr. Collins closing in and their escape route cut off, will Clara and Thomas find a way to evade capture, or is their desperate bid for freedom about to come crashing down? The dimly lit room seemed to close in around Clara as she watched Mr. Collins's figure move through the shadows outside. Her breath caught in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the familiar grip of fear tightening around her. But this time, she forced herself to push it aside. They had come too far to be caught now. Thomas turned back to Sam, his voice low and urgent. "Is there another way out of here?" Sam hesitated, glancing at Clara with a worried frown before nodding. "There's a cellar door in the back that leads to an old tunnel. It was used for smuggling years ago, back when the town had more trouble with the law. It's not much, but it might get you out unseen." Clara's mind raced as she processed the information. It was a slim chance, but it was better than waiting to be found. She met Thomas's gaze, seeing the same determination mirrored in his eyes. "We'll take it." Sam led them quickly through the back of the tavern, his steps quick but quiet, each creak of the floorboard sounding too loud in the tense silence. They reached a small door that led down into the cellar, the air growing colder and mustier as they descended. The darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides, but Clara clung to the hope that the tunnel might offer a way out. Thomas grabbed an old lantern from a shelf, lighting it with a quick, practiced motion. The flame flickered, casting long shadows over the damp stone walls. He handed the lantern to Clara, his expression tight with focus. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "And whatever you do, don't look back." Clara nodded, gripping the lantern with trembling hands as they moved deeper into the cellar. The air grew colder, each step echoing off the narrow walls, but she forced herself to keep going, matching Thomas's pace as they reached a low, half-hidden door set into the stone. Sam opened it with a grunt, revealing the entrance to a tunnel that wound into darkness. "Go on then," Sam urged, glancing nervously up the cellar stairs. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Give you a head start, but don't waste it." Thomas clasped Sam's shoulder briefly, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Sam. We won't forget this." With a final tense nod, Thomas and Clara slipped through the door and into the tunnel, leaving the safety of the tavern behind. Clara's heart raced as the darkness swallowed them, the flickering lantern casting eerie shadows over the damp stone walls. The tunnel was narrow and uneven, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. But each step took them further from Mr. Collins's reach. Above them, the sound of voices echoed faintly through the cellar, men shouting, the crash of a door being forced open. Clara tensed, gripping Thomas's arm tightly as they paused to listen. For a moment, she thought she heard Mr. Collins's voice cutting through the din, sharp and angry. But then the noises faded, swallowed by the earth above them, and she felt a flicker of hope. "Come on," Thomas urged, guiding her forward. "We need to keep moving." They pushed on through the tunnel, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath them. The air grew colder, each breath turning into a misty puff in the lantern's light. Clara focused on the warmth of Thomas's hand, guiding her through the dark, on the steady glow of the lantern, forcing herself to ignore the fear that gnawed at her insides. But just as she began to think they might make it, a sound behind them sent a chill down her spine. The distant clatter of footsteps on stone, echoing through the tunnel. Thomas cursed under his breath, pulling her along faster. They found the entrance. We have to run. Clara's heart pounded as they broke into a desperate sprint. The tunnel walls blurring around them, the lantern swung wildly in her hand, casting shifting shadows that twisted and stretched in the darkness. She could hear the footsteps, growing louder behind them, the shouts of the men carrying through the tunnel. But she didn't dare look back. The tunnel twisted sharply, and they rounded a corner just as a shout rang out behind them. Closer than before, Clara felt a surge of panic, but Thomas's grip on her hand tightened, pulling her forward with renewed urgency. "There's an exit up ahead," he panted, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "If we can make it." Before he could finish, a shot rang out, the deafening crack of a gun echoing through the tunnel. Clara flinched, stumbling as the sound reverberated off the stone walls, and the lantern slipped from her grasp, smashing against the ground and plunging them into darkness. "Clara!" Thomas caught her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her protectively. She could hear the fear in his voice, the urgency as he pulled her upright. "We have to keep moving." Clara blinked against the darkness, her eyes adjusting slowly to the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the tunnel's end. She could see the outline of the exit, a small, jagged opening that led out into the forest beyond. It was so close, just a few more steps, and they would be free. But the footsteps behind them grew louder, and Clara knew that their time was running out. She stumbled forward, Thomas's hand guiding her toward the exit, the rough stone walls scraping against her arms as they squeezed through the narrow gap. The cold night air hit her like a shock, but she barely registered it as she pulled herself free, collapsing onto the forest floor. Thomas emerged beside her, turning back toward the tunnel entrance just in time to see the shadowed figures closing in. He grabbed a large stone from the ground and shoved it into the gap, wedging it tightly to block their pursuers. For a moment, everything was silent, except for their ragged breathing and the distant muffled shouts from within the tunnel. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, struggling to hold back a sob of relief. They had made it. Barely, but they had made it. Thomas knelt beside her, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion, but a flicker of determination still burned in his eyes. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice rough but steady. "We're not safe yet." Clara nodded, forcing herself to her feet. Despite the ache in her muscles, the lingering fear that clung to her like a shadow, she looked back at the tunnel entrance where the stone blocked their pursuers for now, and felt a surge of hope. Fragile, but real. They were still in danger, but for the first time, she felt like there was a chance they might truly escape. Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her through the dark forest. The night seemed colder now, the trees pressing in around them, but Clara held on to the warmth of his presence, the steady strength that kept her moving forward. The cold night wrapped around Clara and Thomas as they stumbled through the dense forest, the moon casting a pale glow over the gnarled roots and twisted branches that blocked their path. Their breaths came in sharp gasps, misting the air in front of them as they pushed forward, each step a fight against the exhaustion that weighed down their limbs. Behind them, the tunnel and the village were left far behind, but the fear of Mr. Collins's pursuit clung to them like a shadow. Thomas kept a firm grip on Clara's hand, guiding her through the darkness. His strength seemed endless, even as fatigue etched lines of strain into his face. Clara could see the determination that drove him forward, a fire that refused to be extinguished despite everything they had endured. They finally paused beside a rocky outcrop, a place where the forest opened up just enough to allow a view of the valley below. Clara sank down onto a fallen log, pressing a hand to her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. Her muscles ached. Her feet were raw from the rough ground, but the desperation that had driven her this far still thrummed through her veins. Thomas crouched beside her, scanning the forest behind them with a wary eye. He had his knife drawn, its edge gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and Clara could see the tension that tightened his shoulders. He was like a coiled spring, ready to act at any moment, even now that they had put some distance between themselves and the danger behind. "They're not far," he murmured, glancing toward the shadows that shifted among the trees. "We bought ourselves some time with that tunnel, but it won't take them long to pick up our trail again." Clara nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow with a trembling hand. She felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest, but she forced herself to push back the rising panic. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper in the still night. Thomas met her gaze, his eyes dark with resolve. "We keep moving, but we need to be smarter about it. Stay off the main paths. Avoid leaving any signs of where we're going. If we can make it to the river, we might be able to lose them in the water." Clara nodded again, trying to draw strength from his determination. But as she looked at him, she could see the exhaustion that lay just beneath the surface. The weariness that came from fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm lightly, offering what comfort she could. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice filled with the weight of everything she couldn't quite put into words. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this, for everything you've done." He shook his head, a small, wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. I made my choice when I decided to help you, and I'd make it again, even knowing the risks." Clara's throat tightened, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her like a blade. She had spent so long feeling like a burden, like a pawn in a game she couldn't control. But here, in this moment, she felt a spark of something she thought she had lost. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was enough to keep her moving, to remind her that she wasn't alone. Thomas squeezed her hand gently, then stood, offering her a hand up. "Come on, let's put some more distance between us and them. The river's a few miles north. If we keep moving, we can reach it by dawn." Clara took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet, and together they plunged back into the forest. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, but she clung to the sound of Thomas's footsteps beside her, the warmth of his hand guiding her through the shadows. She knew that the danger was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they might have a chance. The hours blurred together as they made their way north, following the faint sound of rushing water that grew louder with each passing step. The forest thickened around them, the trees twisting together in tangled knots, but they pressed on, driven by the hope that the river might offer a way to escape Mr. Collins's reach. Finally, Just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, they broke through the tree line and found themselves standing on the banks of a wide, fast-moving river. The water churned over rocks, its surface reflecting the pale light of the morning sky, and the sound of the current drowned out all other noise. Clara fell to her knees beside the riverbank, scooping up a handful of water and drinking deeply. The cold water stung her lips, but it was refreshing, and she could feel a flicker of strength returning to her limbs. Thomas knelt beside her, taking a drink as well, but his gaze never strayed far from the forest behind them. "They'll find our tracks eventually," he said quietly, his voice carrying just above the roar of the river. "But if we can cross to the other side, we might be able to lose them in the forest beyond." Clara glanced at the river, her heart sinking at the sight of the swift current. It looked dangerous, even treacherous, but she knew that Thomas was right. They had no other choice. If they stayed here, it would only be a matter of time before Mr. Collins caught up to them. Thomas seemed to read the hesitation in her expression, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll go first," he said, his tone firm. "I'll find a safe path through the water, and then you follow. Just hold on to me and don't let go." Clara nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She watched as Thomas waded into the river, his steps careful as he tested the depth of the water. The current tugged at him, but he kept moving, bracing himself against the flow as he made his way to the middle of the river. When he turned back to her, motioning for her to follow, Clara forced herself to rise, stepping into the icy water. The cold stole the breath from her lungs, but she clung to Thomas's hand, letting him guide her step by step through the river's rushing current. The water rose to her waist, then her chest, and she could feel the pull of the current trying to drag her downstream. But she kept her grip on Thomas's hand, focusing on his steady voice as he called out each step. "Almost there," he said, his voice strained with the effort of holding them both steady. "Just a little further." Suddenly, a shout rang out from the forest behind them, followed by the crack of another gunshot. Clara flinched, her grip slipping as she stumbled against the current. But Thomas tightened his hold on her, his expression fierce. "Keep moving, Clara. Don't look back." She fought to stay upright, her legs burning with the effort of pushing through the water. She could hear the shouts growing louder, could feel the rush of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. But she forced herself to focus on Thomas's voice, on the warmth of his hand. With one final, desperate push, they reached the opposite bank, collapsing onto the muddy ground as the river roared. Behind them, Thomas pulled Clara close, shielding her with his body as another shot rang out, the bullet striking the rocks near the river's edge. "Run!" he gasped, dragging her to her feet. "We have to keep going." Clara's legs felt like lead, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she forced herself to move, clinging to Thomas as they stumbled into the dense forest beyond the river. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick canopy above, casting fragmented beams of light across the forest floor. Clara and Thomas moved deeper into the woods, their breath coming in short, painful gasps as they pushed through the underbrush. The roar of the river faded behind them, but its icy chill still clung to their skin, and the sound of Mr. Collins's men shouting from across the water echoed in Clara's mind. They didn't stop until the sun had risen high above the treetops, filtering through the leaves. In patches of gold and green, Thomas finally slowed, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. before guiding Clara toward a cluster of rocks that jutted out from a hillside. The overhang provided a small pocket of shelter, hidden from view by thick brambles and low-hanging branches. "We'll rest here for a bit," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. He helped Clara settle against the rocks, then sank down beside her, leaning back with a weary sigh. "We've put some distance between us and them, but we can't stay too long if they manage to cross the river." Clara nodded, understanding the unspoken fear behind his words. Her body ached with exhaustion, every muscle burning from their frantic flight. But she forced herself to remain alert, listening for any sound that might betray their pursuers. The forest was quiet around them, the air filled only with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But she knew better than to let her guard down. She glanced over at Thomas, studying the shadows under his eyes, the lines of strain that carved deeper into his face. He had pushed himself to his limits to keep her safe, and the realization sent a wave of guilt crashing over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she couldn't quite say. "You've risked so much because of me. I never wanted—" "Don't," Thomas interrupted gently, turning to meet her gaze. There was a softness in his expression that caught her by surprise, a flicker of something warm beneath the exhaustion. "You don't need to apologize, Clara. I chose to help you, and I'd do it again, no matter what." Clara's throat tightened, and she looked down, unable to hold his gaze. She had spent so long feeling like a burden, like she was dragging those around her into her own misfortune. But Thomas's words broke through that darkness, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. "I don't know why you believe in me," she admitted, her voice barely more than a breath. "But thank you." Thomas reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that was both gentle and grounding. "I believe in you, Clara, because I see someone who refuses to be broken, even when the world is trying to crush her, and because I know what it's like to have everything taken from you." Clara turned to him, a question in her eyes, but before she could ask, he looked away, his expression growing distant. She sensed that he was carrying his own wounds, his own ghosts that had yet to be spoken of. But for now, she let the silence linger between them, a fragile understanding that didn't need words. They sat together in the shelter of the rocks, sharing the last of the bread Clara had brought in her bundle. It was stale and meager, but the taste of it was a comfort, a reminder that they had survived another night, another desperate chase. Clara closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the forest seep into her bones, trying to ignore the ache of hunger that gnawed at her insides. But her mind kept drifting back to Mr. Collins, to the way he had hunted them through the night with a relentless determination that chilled her to the core. She knew that he wouldn't stop, not until he had her back under his control, and the thought filled her with a cold, simmering fear. "Thomas," she said softly, opening her eyes to find him watching the forest beyond their shelter. "If they find us again, if we don't make it—" Thomas turned to her, his expression hardening with a resolve that made her breath catch. "They won't take you back, Clara. I won't let them." He glanced at the knife in his belt, his hand tightening around the worn handle. "I'll fight them if I have to." Clara's heart twisted at the fierceness in his voice, the protectiveness that lay beneath it. She reached out, covering his hand with hers, feeling the warmth of his skin against her cold fingers. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her fear. I couldn't bear it. Thomas's expression softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. I'm not afraid of them, Clara, not anymore, but I am afraid of losing you to him, to whatever life he's trying to force you into. You deserve more than that. You deserve to choose your own path. Clara swallowed back the tears that threatened to spill over, blinking against the sudden blur of her vision. It had been so long since anyone had believed in her like this, since anyone had seen her as more than a burden or a means to an end. She clung to Thomas's words, letting them anchor her against the tide of fear that threatened to drag her under. But before she could respond, a faint sound reached their ears, a distant crack of a branch, the unmistakable murmur of voices drifting through the trees. Clara's blood ran cold, and she stiffened, her grip tightening on Thomas's hand. They're coming, she breathed, her voice barely more than a whisper. She could see the same realization dawning in Thomas's eyes, the tension that rippled through his body as he reached for his knife. We have to move, he said, urgently pulling her to her feet. They're too close. If they find us here. Clara nodded, swallowing back the terror that clawed at her throat. She clutched Thomas's hand tightly as they slipped out from under the rocky overhang, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth, every sound amplified in the stillness. They moved swiftly through the underbrush, following the winding paths that twisted through the dense trees. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, every nerve on edge as she strained to listen for the sound of pursuit. But the forest remained quiet, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, slanting beams of light through the canopy. Thomas led her toward a deeper part of the forest, where the trees grew closer together, their branches weaving into a dark, protective web. As they pushed through the thick undergrowth, Clara caught sight of a small, half-ruined cabin nestled among the roots of an ancient oak, hidden by a thick curtain of ivy. Here, Thomas whispered, guiding her toward the cabin. It's not much, but it'll give us cover for the night. Clara glanced back toward the forest behind them, her mind filled with the image of Mr. Collins's cold eyes, the memory of his voice promising that he would not let her go. But as she followed Thomas into the shadowed safety of the cabin, she felt a flicker of hope, small and fragile, but enough to keep her moving forward. The shadows deepened as dusk fell, turning the small, crumbling cabin into a haven of darkness. Clara and Thomas crouched inside, their breaths barely audible in the silence that pressed down on them like a weight. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and ivy, mingling with the faint metallic tang of fear that lingered between them. Through a crack in the cabin's rotting wall, Clara peered out into the forest, her heart thudding in her chest. She could see the distant flicker of lanterns moving through the trees, the glow growing closer with every passing minute. Her pulse quickened, a cold knot of panic tightening in her stomach. They're coming, she whispered, turning to Thomas, who knelt beside her, clutching his knife tightly. They'll be here soon. Thomas nodded, his jaw set with a grim determination. He glanced around the cabin, his mind clearly racing through their options. If we run now, they'll hear us. We have to wait until they get closer. Then maybe we can slip past them in the dark. Clara swallowed hard, the reality of their situation crashing over her like a wave. This time, there, would be no more hiding, no more second chances. If they were caught, she knew that Mr. Collins would not be merciful. He would drag her back to the manor, locking her away in a life of servitude, and she would never see the sky or feel the wind on her face again. A shiver ran through her, but she reached out, gripping Thomas's arm tightly. "We can't let him win, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of her fear. "I won't go back, not after everything. I'd rather—" "You won't have to," Thomas interrupted, his voice fierce and unyielding. He turned to her, his eyes burning with a fire that matched her own. "No matter what happens, I won't let him take you, not while I'm still breathing." Clara's breath hitched at the intensity in his words, a lump forming in her throat. She knew that Thomas meant every word, that he would fight to the end to protect her. And in that moment, something shifted between them, a connection forged in the crucible of fear and hope, a bond that felt like it could withstand even the darkness that surrounded them. She held his gaze, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them, before finally nodding. "Together, then," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "We face this together." The minutes crawled by, stretching out in a tense silence as the lanterns moved closer, their light casting eerie shadows over the forest floor. Clara pressed herself against the cabin wall, her heart racing as she listened to the faint murmur of voices, the crunch of boots on fallen leaves. She could make out Mr. Collins's voice among them, cold and commanding, cutting through the night like a blade. "Spread out," he ordered, his tone laced with the assurance of a man who knew he was closing in on his prey. "Search the woods. They can't have gotten far." Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers, grounding her against the wave of panic that surged through her. They stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as the men spread out through the trees, their lanterns bobbing like ghostly fireflies in the dark. But just as Clara thought they might slip by unnoticed, the beam of a lantern swept across the cabin, catching the faint outline of their shadowed figures through the gaps in the wood. A shout rang out, sharp and triumphant. "Here! They're hiding here!" Thomas reacted instantly, pulling Clara down behind a stack of broken crates, just as a shot rang out, splintering the rotted wood of the wall above their heads. He pressed the knife into her hands, his voice low and urgent. "Stay down, Clara. I'll distract them. Give you a chance to run." "No." Clara grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. "I'm not leaving you, Thomas." Hiding place, slipping out through the back of the cabin just as the door crashed open, Mr. Collins and his men flooding inside. Clara and Thomas darted into the underbrush, weaving through the trees as bullets whizzed past them, tearing through the leaves. The night was filled with the shouts of their pursuers, the snap of branches underfoot. But they kept moving, driven by a desperate determination. Thomas fought like a man possessed, using every trick he knew to keep the men off their trail. He led Clara through a maze of thick bushes, doubling back and circling around until the sounds of their pursuers grew distant, swallowed by the forest's depths. But just as they thought they might have lost them, Mr. Collins emerged from the darkness, his face twisted with a mix of rage and satisfaction. He raised his gun, leveling it at Clara, his voice dripping with venom. "Enough games, Clara. You're coming. Back with me now." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground, raising the knife in her trembling hands. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'd rather die than go back to you," Mr. Collins sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "That can be arranged." Before he could fire, Thomas lunged forward, knocking the gun aside. The shot rang out, shattering the night, but the bullet went wide, burying itself in a tree. The two men grappled, struggling for control of the weapon, their shadows twisting together in a brutal dance. Clara watched, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but then she saw an opening. A moment when Mr. Collins's attention was focused solely on Thomas. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she rushed forward, driving the knife into Mr. Collins's arm. He cried out, the gun slipping from his grasp as he staggered back, clutching his wounded arm. Thomas wasted no time, delivering a swift blow that sent Mr. Collins crashing to the ground, his lantern spilling across the forest floor. Clara stood over him, her hands trembling with the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the sound of their ragged breathing and the crackling of the flames that licked at the fallen lantern. Mr. Collins glared up at her, hatred burning in his eyes. But there was fear there too, a fear that she had never seen before. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten or beg, but Clara cut him off, her voice steady and unyielding. "You'll never control me again. This ends now." She turned away, taking Thomas's hand as they stepped back from the spreading flames. They watched as the fire consumed the lantern's oil, catching on the dry leaves and branches, the heat driving them back into the shadows. Together, they disappeared into the dark forest, leaving the crackling flames and Mr. Collins's shouts behind them. The fire spread through the undergrowth, a wall of light that seemed to close the chapter on everything that had come before. The night stretched on, dark and cold, but the flames that had erupted from the spilled lantern painted the sky with a glow that lit the treetops like a distant sunrise. Clara and Thomas moved swiftly through the shadows, leaving the crackling fire and the chaos behind them. Their footsteps crunched on fallen leaves, the cool night air filling their lungs as they pushed deeper into the woods. It wasn't until they reached the far side of a quiet valley that they allowed themselves to slow. The sounds of the burning forest fading to a distant crackle behind them. They stopped beside a stream, its waters glinting under the pale light of the moon. Clara sank down onto the bank, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her heart still racing from the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. Thomas crouched beside her, his face lined with dirt and sweat, but there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes as he looked at her. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest, warmth that had nothing to do with the fire they had left behind. "It's over, Clara," he said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "He won't be able to hurt you anymore." Clara closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. For so long she had dreamed of this moment, of being free from the suffocating grip of Mr. Collins, from the weight of her father's betrayal. But now that it had finally come, the emotions that surged through her were almost too much to bear. Relief, grief, hope, and fear, tangled together in a knot that lodged in her throat. She opened her eyes and looked at Thomas, the man who had risked everything to stand by her side. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, feeling the roughness of his calloused palm against her skin. "I couldn't have done this without you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Thomas, in more ways than you know." He shook his head, a soft, almost self-conscious smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't save you, Clara. You saved yourself. I just helped you find the way." They sat together by the stream, the water murmuring softly as it flowed over the stones. Clara felt the tension that had gripped her for so long begin to ease, replaced by a quiet peace that settled into her bones. For the first time, the future stretched out before her like an open road, filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. They made their way through the woods as the night wore on, moving slowly but steadily toward the edge of the forest. When dawn finally broke, it brought with it a golden light that spilled over the treetops, casting long shadows over the land. The forest, which had once seemed so dark and threatening, now glowed with a gentle warmth, and Clara found herself taking in the beauty of the morning. With new eyes, Thomas walked beside her, his arm brushing hers. With each step, a steady presence that grounded her against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They spoke little, but there was a comfort in their silence, a sense that they no longer needed words to understand each other. As they reached a hill overlooking the valley, they paused to take in the view. Below them, a small village nestled among the fields, its rooftops glinting in the morning sun. Clara's breath caught at the sight, a place that seemed untouched by the pain and danger they had left behind. Thomas turned to her, his expression filled with quiet determination. "We can start over, Clara," he said, his voice carrying a hope that she had almost forgotten how to feel. "We don't have to go back to the life we knew. We can build something new, together." Clara met his gaze, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. For so long she had felt trapped, like her fate was being decided by others, like she was being swept along by forces beyond her control. But now, with the sun rising before her and the weight of the past falling away, she realized that the power to choose had always been hers. A small smile tugged at her lips, a smile that felt like the first genuine expression of hope she had allowed herself in years. She reached out, taking Thomas's hand, and together they stood on the hill, looking out at the world that lay before them. "Let's find our own path," Clara said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "No more running, no more fear, just a chance to live." Thomas's smile widened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "A chance to live," he echoed, the promise of a new beginning shining in his eyes. As they descended the hill, walking hand in hand toward the village, Clara felt the first rays of the sun warming her face. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that they would still face challenges and hardships, but she also knew that they would face them together, as equals, as partners, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt a deep, unshakable belief that she was truly free, free to choose her own destiny, free to build a life of her own making, a life filled with the hope of what could be, rather than the shadow of what had been. As Clara and Thomas walk toward a new life, their journey may be uncertain, but their hearts are filled with a hope that cannot be extinguished. Together, they have found the courage to dream again, and the strength to turn those dreams into reality.